The speaker on the office wall crackled to life at exactly 9:15 in the morning, and Mira Bennett felt her stomach drop before she even understood why. She was standing by the coffee machine on the fourth floor of Halden Media, holding a paper cup that was slowly going cold in her hand. Around her, people moved through their normal routines, laughing at something on a screen, tapping on keyboards, calling out names across the open floor. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing about the morning had warned her that her whole world was about to break open in front of everyone she worked with. Then she heard her own voice come out of the speakers. It was soft at first, almost shy, the way she always sounded when she spoke into her phone late at night with the lights off and the door locked. The voice said, "I saw him today, and my heart nearly stopped when he smiled at me in the hallway. I know it is silly. I know he probably does not even remember doing it, but I have to say this somewhere, because if I do not, I think I will lose my mind." For one full second, Mira thought she must be imagining it. She told herself it was a prank, or a glitch, or someone else's voice that only sounded like hers. But then the recording continued, and she recognized the exact words she had whispered into her phone nearly 10 years ago, on a night when she was 19 years old, and sitting on the floor of her college dorm room with her knees pulled up to her chest. Her cup slipped from her fingers. Coffee spread across the tile floor in a dark spreading stain, but she did not move to clean it up. She could not move at all. Across the office, heads began to turn. Someone near the printer laughed, thinking it was a joke, a strange bit being played over the speakers before a meeting. Then more people looked up, phones lowering, conversations dying out one by one as the voice kept talking, steady and clear, filling every corner of the open floor plan. "I know his name is Daniel Hart," the recording said. "I know he takes his coffee black, no sugar, and that he always double knots his shoes before he runs. I know he laughs loudest at his own jokes, and that he still feels bad about it 2 seconds later. I do not know why I notice these things. I do not know why I cannot stop." Mira's whole body went cold. She looked past the crowd of confused co-workers, past the rows of desks and the tall glass windows, and found him standing near the meeting room doors with a folder in his hand. Daniel Hart had frozen completely still. He was 30 years old now, tall, with the kind of quiet, steady presence that made people trust him within minutes of meeting him. He had worked at Halden Media for almost 2 years, and in that time, Mira had learned to keep a careful distance, close enough to remain friendly, far enough that no one would ever guess the truth. That careful distance was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. He was staring straight at the speaker mounted near the ceiling, his folder hanging loosely at his side, his face unreadable. Somebody near him whispered something, and he did not answer. He simply stood there, listening, as 10 years of Mira's most private thoughts poured out over the office sound system, like a flood breaking through a wall that had held for far too long. Mira's mind raced back to how this could have happened. She used a small voice app on her phone to record her thoughts, an old habit she had never managed to break, something she had started back in university as a way of getting through the days when her feelings became too loud to carry alone. She always assumed the recordings were private, locked behind a password only she knew, stored quietly on a cloud account she rarely thought about. She had never told a single person they existed. But 2 nights ago, it had rolled out a new update to the building's internal communication system, one that synced employee devices to a shared media panel for presentations and music during office events. Mira had approved the update without reading the details, the way almost everyone had. She had no idea her personal voice app was somehow linked to the same account she used for work files, no idea that a setting buried 3 menus deep had quietly connected her private recordings to the very system now broadcasting them to 200 people. She would learn all of this later, once the panic settled and someone from IT explained it to her in a small, apologetic voice. In this moment, standing frozen by a puddle of spilled coffee, she understood only one thing clearly. Daniel was hearing everything. The recording continued, moving from one memory to the next, each one more intimate than the last. It spoke of the way Mira used to walk past his desk twice, sometimes 3 times, just to catch a glimpse of him working. It spoke of the birthday she had once helped plan for him, without ever telling him she had done it, staying late after everyone else had gone home, just to make sure the decorations were perfect. It spoke of nights she had cried quietly into her pillow after watching him leave the office with someone else, smiling in a way he never smiled at her. A woman named Priya, who sat 2 desks away from Mira, turned toward her with wide, startled eyes. "Is that you?" she mouthed silently, and Mira could not answer. Her throat had closed completely. Someone finally moved toward the control panel near the reception desk, fumbling with buttons, trying to figure out how to shut off the sound. It took almost a full minute, a minute that felt like an hour, before the voice cut off mid-sentence, leaving a ringing silence behind it that felt somehow louder than the recording itself. Nobody spoke. The whole floor stood still, phones forgotten, keyboards untouched. All attention balanced between Mira standing by the coffee machine and Daniel standing by the meeting room doors. The distance between them had never felt so impossible to cross. Daniel set his folder down slowly on the nearest desk. He did not look angry. He looked stunned, the way a person looks after stepping outside into bright light, after being in the dark for a long time, blinking, trying to adjust to something too large to take in all at once. Mira wanted to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn and disappear into the stairwell, to keep walking until she was outside the building, down the street, anywhere but here. But her legs would not move, and before she could force herself into action, Daniel started walking toward her. The office seemed to part around him as he crossed the floor, people stepping back instinctively, sensing that whatever was about to happen was not meant for an audience, even though everyone present had just become one anyway. Mira watched him approach with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears, and for one wild moment, she considered pretending the whole thing was some kind of mistake, a strange coincidence, a recording that only happened to sound like her voice. But there was no use lying, not anymore. Not after everyone in the building had just heard the truth spoken in her own voice, using her own words, describing a man who was now standing 3 feet away from her, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "Mira," he said quietly, and just her name from his mouth in that moment felt like the ground shifting beneath her feet. "Was that you?" She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Her hands were shaking. Somewhere behind Daniel, Priya had covered her mouth with both hands, clearly torn between shock and the sudden understanding of years of small details that now made perfect sense. Other co-workers had begun to whisper among themselves, already turning the moment into office legend before it had even finished happening. "I need you to tell me the truth," Daniel said, his voice low, meant only for her, even though half the floor could still hear him. "Have you been recording things about me? For how long?" Mira felt tears rising, hot and unstoppable, blurring the edges of the room until Daniel's face was the only thing she could clearly see. 10 years, she whispered, the words breaking apart as they left her. "Since university. Since the very first day I met you." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, something between disbelief and a memory trying hard to surface. His eyes searched her face, as if he were seeing her for the first time, even though they had known each other, in one way or another, for a full decade. 10 years, he repeated softly, almost to himself. Around them, the office slowly began to move again, people pretending to return to their screens, while clearly still listening, still watching from the corners of their eyes. But for Mira, the world had narrowed down to this single moment, standing in a puddle of cold coffee with tears sliding down her face, waiting to see whether the truth she had hidden for 10 long years would destroy everything, or somehow, impossibly, begin something new. Daniel did not say another word right away. He simply looked at her, his jaw tight, his hands curling slightly at his sides, as if he did not know what to do with them. Then he turned and walked toward the emergency stairwell door at the end of the hall, pushing it open without looking back. Mira stood frozen for a heartbeat, watching the door swing shut behind him, before something inside her broke loose. She left her coffee cup lying on the floor, left the stairs and the whispers behind her, and ran after him, her shoes slipping slightly on the tile, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had spent 10 years hiding her feelings behind silence, behind small gestures no one ever noticed, behind a locked app on her phone that was supposed to be the one place her secret would always be safe. Now the truth was out, spilled across an entire office in her own trembling voice, and there was no way to take it back, no way to pretend it had never happened. All she could do now was follow him through that stairwell door and finally say, out loud, everything she had spent a decade recording only for herself. The door was heavy under her hand as she pushed it open, the stairwell cold and echoing after the warmth of the office floor. Daniel stood a few steps down, one hand braced against the railing, his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. "Daniel," she said, her voice cracking on his name. He did not turn around right away. For a long moment, the only sound in the stairwell was her own uneven breathing and the distant hum of the building around them. Then, finally, he spoke, without looking at her, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it. 10 years, he said again, and I never knew. Mira gripped the railing to keep herself steady, because everything she had spent a decade trying to bury was finally standing in front of her, demanding to be explained, and she understood, with a strange and terrifying clarity, that there was no version of her life after this moment that would look anything like the one before it. 10 years earlier, Mira Bennett had been a 19-year-old university student who believed she understood exactly what her life was going to look like. She was studying journalism at a small college in a town called Ashford, living in a cramped dormitory with a roommate named Nora, who talked in her sleep and left wet towels on the floor. Mira spent most of her days buried in textbooks, chasing deadlines for the student newspaper, and telling herself that she did not need anything more exciting than that to feel content. Then, on a rainy afternoon in late September, she walked into a lecture hall 5 minutes late and found every seat taken except one, right beside a boy she had never seen before. His name was Daniel Hart, and he was reading a battered paperback novel instead of paying attention to the professor, his damp hair pushed back from his forehead, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Mira slid into the seat next to him, embarrassed and out of breath, and he glanced up just long enough to give her a small, easy smile before returning to his book. That was all it took. One smile, barely 2 seconds long, and something inside Mira shifted in a way she did not fully understand until much later. She told herself it meant nothing. People smiled at strangers all the time. It was polite, ordinary, forgettable. But that night, lying awake in her narrow dormitory bed, while Nora snored softly across the room, Mira found herself thinking about the way his eyes had crinkled slightly at the corners, the way his voice had sounded when he quietly thanked the professor for handing back a graded paper. She thought about it so much that she could not sleep, and somewhere around midnight, she reached for her phone, opened a small voice recording app she had downloaded months earlier to practice interview questions for the school paper, and pressed record for the first time, with a different purpose in mind. "I met someone today," she whispered into the darkness of her room. "His name is Daniel. He probably does not even remember my name, and that is fine, because I am never going to see him again anyway. I just wanted to say this out loud once." She saved the recording, locked her phone, and told herself that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 2 days later, she saw him again in the same lecture hall, and this time, he remembered her name before she remembered to introduce herself. "Mira, right," he said, settling into the seat beside her, as if it had always belonged to him. "You looked like you were about to fall asleep standing up last time." She laughed, surprised, and something about the sound of her own laughter around him felt different from her laughter around anyone else. They started sitting together out of habit after that, comparing notes, complaining about assignments, sharing the kind of easy conversation that made an hour-long lecture feel shorter than it should have. Daniel was studying business, planning to eventually take over his family's small furniture company back in his hometown, and he talked about it with a mixture of dread and quiet determination that Mira found strangely endearing. Within a few weeks, they had become something like friends, the kind of casual campus friendship built on shared classes and convenient timing rather than any deep effort. Mira told herself that was enough. She told herself this every single night, right before she opened her voice recording app and added another entry to a growing collection she never intended to show anyone. Nora eventually caught her at it, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her phone held close to her mouth, whispering into the dark. "What are you doing?" Nora asked one night, propping herself up on one elbow, squinting through the dim light of her desk lamp. Mira froze, phone still in hand, cheeks burning. Nothing, she said quickly. Just recording notes for an assignment. Nora did not believe her, not entirely, but she was too tired to push the question further, and Mira was too relieved to offer any more explanation. From that point on, she waited until Nora had fallen fully asleep before pressing record, speaking in a hush barely above a breath, careful never to let her secret slip into the daylight hours where anyone might notice. The recordings became a ritual. After every conversation with Daniel, no matter how small, Mira would return to her room and narrate it into her phone, capturing details she was terrified she might otherwise forget. The way he tapped his pen against the desk when he was thinking. The way he always let other students go ahead of him in the cafeteria line, even when he was clearly starving. The way his voice softened whenever he talked about his younger sister, a habit that told Mira more about his character than anything else could have. She told herself she was simply keeping a journal, the same way other people kept diaries about their days. She told herself the fact that almost every entry somehow circled back to Daniel Hart was purely coincidental, a strange accident of timing, rather than anything worth examining too closely. By the middle of the school year, Mira understood, in the quiet and honest part of her mind she rarely let herself listen to, that she had fallen for a boy who saw her only as a friend, and that admitting this out loud, to him or to anyone else, felt far more frightening than simply carrying the feeling alone. There was a night in November when the two of them stayed up late in the university library, working on a group project that had nothing to do with either of their majors, thrown together by an elective course neither of them particularly enjoyed. The library had emptied out around them, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional distant cough from another student buried behind a stack of books. Somewhere around midnight, Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes, and said, "You know, I am glad I ended up in that class. I would have hated doing this project with anyone else." Mira's heart had climbed straight into her throat. "Yeah," she managed to say, keeping her eyes on the laptop screen in front of her, so he would not see how much those simple words had affected her. "Me too." He had smiled at her then, the same easy smile from that first rainy day, and for one dangerous second, Mira let herself imagine what it might feel like if he meant those words the way she wished he did. But the moment passed, as moments like that always seem to, and Daniel gathered his things a few minutes later, saying he had an early class, leaving her alone at the table with her racing heart and her carefully guarded secret. She did not go back to her dorm room right away that night. Instead, she sat outside the library on a cold stone bench, phone in hand, and recorded the longest entry she had made yet, describing every small detail of the evening in a voice that trembled slightly in the November air. "I think I might actually be in love with him," she admitted to the recording, the words leaving her more easily in the dark and the cold than they ever could have in daylight. "I know it is ridiculous. I know we have known each other for less than 3 months, but I have never felt like this before, and I do not know what to do with it except say it here, where no one will ever hear it but me." She had no way of knowing, sitting on that cold bench with her breath fogging in the night air, that those exact words would one day play through an office speaker system in front of the very man they were about, 10 years and an entire lifetime away from that quiet library night in Ashford. For the rest of that first year, Mira and Daniel remained close, drifting in and out of each other's daily routines with an ease that felt, to Mira at least, like something almost meant to be. They studied together, ate lunch together when their schedules allowed it, and slowly built the kind of friendship that outsiders sometimes mistook for something more. Nora certainly thought so. "You two are basically dating without the dating part," she said one afternoon, watching Mira get ready to meet Daniel for coffee before an exam. Mira had laughed it off, insisting they were just friends, even as her stomach twisted with the familiar mixture of hope and dread that any mention of Daniel always produced in her. She kept recording. Some nights it was only a sentence or two, quick observations about something he had said or done. Other nights, especially after harder days, the recordings stretched on for several minutes, filled with worries about whether she would ever find the courage to tell him the truth, and quiet fears about what might happen to their friendship if she did. By the end of that first year, the collection of recordings on her phone had grown into something enormous, a private archive of feelings she had never planned to keep for so long, let alone in such detail. She backed them up to a cloud storage account almost without thinking, the same instinct that made her back up her class notes and photographs, never imagining that this simple, practical habit would one day become the very thing that exposed her. Summer came, and with it, a separation that felt, at the time, unbearable. Daniel went home to help with his family's furniture business for the break, while Mira stayed on campus for a summer internship at a local newspaper. They texted occasionally, short messages about nothing important, but the daily closeness they had built over the school year faded into something quieter, more distant. Mira recorded an entry almost every night that summer, describing the strange ache of missing someone she was not even allowed to admit she missed in the way she truly did. She spoke about wondering if he was thinking about her at all, about the small, embarrassing hope that flared each time her phone lit up with his name, even though the messages themselves rarely said anything meaningful. "I do not know how to stop feeling this way," she admitted one August night, sitting on the fire escape outside her summer apartment, watching the lights of the town below her. "I have tried, I really have. But every time I think I am starting to move on, something reminds me of him, and it all comes rushing back like nothing ever changed." When September arrived, and the new school year began, Mira and Daniel picked up almost exactly where they had left off, as if the summer apart had never happened at all. Mira told herself this was a good sign, proof that whatever connection existed between them was strong enough to survive distance and silence. She did not yet understand how many more years would pass, how many more recordings she would make, before anything about that connection would ever change into something more than the careful, one-sided friendship she had grown so used to living inside. By their second year at the university, Mira's habit of recording her private thoughts had become so automatic that she barely noticed herself doing it anymore. It was simply part of her routine, as natural as brushing her teeth before bed or checking her class schedule in the morning. She kept the recordings organized by month, though she never once considered listening back to them herself. The act of speaking the words out loud was enough. It let the feelings leave her body, even if only for a moment, before the next day arrived and the whole cycle started again. Daniel, meanwhile, had no idea any of this existed. To him, Mira Bennett was simply one of his closest friends at Ashford, someone he could talk to about anything from a difficult professor to his complicated feelings about eventually taking over his family's furniture business. He often told her things he did not tell anyone else, including his roommate, a loud and cheerful young man named Cole who spent more time playing video games than attending class. "You are easy to talk to," Daniel told her once, during a long walk across campus, after a particularly frustrating meeting with his academic advisor. "I do not know why, I just feel like you actually listen." Mira had smiled and told him it was nothing special, that she just enjoyed hearing about his life, which was true in a way far deeper than she ever let him see. That night, she recorded an entry describing the conversation in careful detail, her voice catching slightly when she repeated his words back to herself in the quiet of her room. "He said I am easy to talk to," she whispered into her phone. "I wish that meant what I want it to mean. I wish being easy to talk to was the same as being someone he could fall in love with, but I know it is not. I know friends say things like that to friends all the time." As the months passed, Mira watched Daniel begin dating other people, casual relationships that rarely lasted more than a few weeks at a time. Each time he mentioned a new name, Mira felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a mixture of jealousy and quiet grief that she was careful never to let show on her face. She learned to nod along, to ask polite questions, to offer advice when he came to her confused about whether a relationship was worth continuing. There was a girl named Ellie in his business classes who dated Daniel for almost 2 months during their second year, and Mira remembered that period as one of the hardest of her college life. She continued meeting Daniel for coffee and study sessions during those weeks, forcing herself to smile through conversations about how things were going with Ellie, all while recording entry after entry late at night, trying to process feelings she refused to let anyone see in daylight. "I do not hate her," Mira admitted one night, several weeks into Daniel and Ellie's relationship. "I do not even really know her well enough to hate her. I just hate that it is not me. I hate watching him light up when he talks about someone else, knowing I will probably never see that same look directed at me." When Daniel and Ellie eventually broke up, quietly and without much drama, Mira felt a small, guilty relief that she immediately tried to bury under layers of sympathy for her friend's disappointment. She spent an entire evening listening to Daniel talk through what had gone wrong, offering comfort and advice, while privately recording, later that night, a confession she would never have dared say to his face. "Part of me is glad," she admitted to her phone, her voice thick with shame even as she said it. "I know that makes me a terrible friend. I know I should only want him to be happy, no matter who makes him happy. But some small, selfish part of me cannot help hoping that maybe, someday, it will be my turn." It was during their third year at Ashford that Mira came closest to telling Daniel the truth. It happened on a warm spring evening, just after final exams had ended, when the two of them found themselves alone on the university's rooftop garden, a quiet spot mostly used by graduate students that Daniel had somehow discovered and shared with her months earlier. They sat together on a low stone wall, watching the last of the sunset fade behind the campus buildings, both of them relieved and exhausted after weeks of studying. Daniel had brought a small bottle of sparkling cider to celebrate the end of exams, pouring it into 2 paper cups and handing one to Mira with a tired but genuine smile. "To surviving another year," he said, raising his cup toward hers. "To surviving," she echoed, and they both drank in comfortable silence, watching the sky shift from orange to a deep, soft purple above them. After a while, Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, and Mira's heart immediately began to race, wondering, hoping, fearing what might come next. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I do not really know what I am doing with my life," he admitted, staring out at the darkening skyline rather than at her. "Everyone expects me to just take over the family business, and I will, because that is what is expected of me. But sometimes I wonder what would happen if I actually got to choose. I have never told anyone that, not even my sister." Mira felt her chest tighten with a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that the conversation was not what she had briefly hoped for, disappointment for the exact same reason. But underneath both of those feelings was something else entirely, a quiet warmth at the fact that he had chosen to share something so personal with her, something he had never told anyone else. "I think it is brave that you are even thinking about it," she said honestly. "Most people never question what is expected of them. The fact that you do says a lot about who you are." Daniel had turned to look at her then, something soft and searching in his expression, and for one long, suspended moment, Mira let herself believe that maybe this was the moment everything might change between them. The silence stretched, charged with something neither of them named, and Mira's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. But then Daniel looked away, clearing his throat, and the moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. "Thanks for listening," he said, his voice returning to its usual easy tone. "I mean it." Mira nodded, forcing a smile, and the rest of the evening continued as though nothing significant had happened at all, even though to Mira, it felt as though an entire universe of possibility had opened and closed within the space of a few silent seconds. She recorded that night for nearly 20 minutes, longer than any entry before it, describing every detail of the rooftop, the sunset, the sparkling cider, and the moment she was certain, for just a heartbeat, that Daniel had almost said something more. "I do not know what stopped him," she said into her phone, sitting on the edge of her bed long after midnight. "Maybe nothing was going to happen at all, and I am just imagining things because I want them so badly. But for 1 second, I really thought he was about to say something. And I am so scared that if I had said something first, everything between us would have changed, and not necessarily in a good way. So I said nothing. Again, like always." The rest of their third year passed in much the same pattern as the two before it, filled with easy friendship on the surface, and an ocean of unspoken feeling underneath. Mira continued recording, filling her phone's storage with entry after entry, each one a small, private confession that she believed with complete certainty would never be heard by anyone but herself. She had no reason to doubt that belief. The recordings were locked behind a password, stored in a cloud account she rarely thought about, beyond the automatic backups her phone performed each night. It never once occurred to her that a decade later, a simple software update to an office communication system might reach into that quiet, private corner of her life and pull every single word out into the open, in front of the very person those words had always been about. For now, in the safety of her third year at Ashford, Mira believed her secret was as safe as it had ever been. She had no idea how much longer she would carry it, how many more years would pass before circumstances finally forced the truth into the light, or how completely different her life would look once that truth could no longer be contained. Graduation arrived faster than Mira ever expected it to. One moment she was a nervous 19-year-old sliding into a seat beside a stranger in a rainy lecture hall, and the next, she was standing in a cap and gown on a warm May afternoon, watching Daniel Hart cross the stage to receive his diploma, while his family cheered loudly from the audience. She clapped along with everyone else, smiling so hard her cheeks ached, even as something heavy settled in her chest at the realization that their years of easy, daily closeness were about to come to an end. Daniel was moving back to his hometown to begin working at his family's furniture company, just as he had always known he would. Mira had accepted a junior reporting position at a small newspaper 2 states away, a job she had worked hard for and genuinely wanted, even though taking it meant putting real distance between herself and the person she had spent 4 years quietly loving from a careful distance. They exchanged numbers they already had, promised to keep in touch the way graduates always promise, and hugged tightly outside the ceremony, while Daniel's mother took a photograph of the two of them that Mira would keep, unknowingly, for the next decade. "I am really going to miss this," Daniel said, holding her at arm's length after the hug ended, his eyes warm and a little sad. "4 years of you being my favorite study partner, and now what am I supposed to do? Find someone else to save you from failing statistics," Mira said, forcing lightness into her voice even as her heart cracked quietly in her chest. Daniel laughed, and for a moment, standing there in their caps and gowns with the late afternoon sun behind them, everything felt simple and warm and painfully temporary. "Stay in touch, okay?" he said, more seriously this time. "I mean it, Mira. You are one of the best friends I have ever had." She promised she would, and she meant it, even though some part of her already understood that distance had a way of quietly eroding even the strongest friendships, no matter how much both people wanted to hold on. That night, alone in the small apartment she was already half-packed to leave, Mira recorded one of the longest entries she had ever made, nearly 30 minutes long, describing every detail of graduation day, the ceremony, the photograph, the hug, and the quiet ache of watching someone she loved walk toward a completely different life than her own. "I do not know when I am going to see him again," she admitted, her voice unsteady. "Maybe at a wedding someday, if we are lucky enough to still be in touch by then. Maybe never again after this year, if life just pulls us in different directions the way it does to everyone. I always thought I would tell him eventually. I always told myself there was still time. But now there might not be any more time at all, and I let it slip away without ever saying a single word." The first year after graduation was, in some ways, easier than Mira expected. She threw herself into her new job, learning the rhythms of a busy newsroom, chasing local stories about town council meetings and small business openings, slowly building a career she was proud of, even when it exhausted her completely. Daniel, for his part, settled into life at his family's furniture company, learning the business from the ground up under his father's careful guidance. They texted occasionally at first, congratulating each other on small milestones, sharing the occasional photo or funny story. But as the months passed, the messages grew further apart. The way messages so often do once daily proximity is no longer there to keep a connection alive. Mira told herself this was normal, that distance changed every friendship eventually, and that it did not mean anything had been lost that mattered. She kept recording anyway. Even without daily contact, Daniel remained a constant presence in her private thoughts, resurfacing in memories triggered by the smallest things. A certain kind of laugh overheard in a coffee shop, a song that had played during one of their late-night study sessions, a piece of furniture in a store window that reminded her of the company he now worked for. "I saw a chair today that looked like something his family might make," she recorded one evening, nearly a year after graduation. "I do not even know why that made me think of him so strongly. I have not talked to him in almost 3 weeks. I wonder if he thinks about me even a fraction as often as I think about him. I doubt it, but I still hope." It was around this time that Mira began dating other people, encouraged by well-meaning friends who insisted she needed to move on from whatever she was still holding on to. She went on dates with kind, interesting men who genuinely liked her, men who complimented her writing and asked thoughtful questions about her work, and seemed, by every reasonable measure, like good matches for her. None of it ever quite worked. She would find herself, halfway through a pleasant dinner with a perfectly nice man, suddenly comparing his laugh to Daniel's laugh, his conversation style to Daniel's conversation style, and feeling, every single time, a quiet disappointment that she was careful never to let show on her face. "I know it is not fair to any of them," she admitted in a recording, after ending things with a particularly kind man named Grant, who had wanted, quite reasonably, to keep dating her seriously. "I know I am comparing every single person to someone who does not even know how I feel about him. It is not fair to them, and honestly, it is not fair to me either. But I do not know how to stop." 2 years after graduation, Mira received a text from Daniel that made her heart leap in a way she had almost forgotten it could. He was coming to her city for a work conference and wondered if she would want to grab dinner while he was in town. She spent nearly an hour deciding what to wear, an embarrassment she readily admitted to her recording that night, laughing softly at herself, even as her hands trembled with nervous excitement. When she finally saw him again, standing outside the restaurant in a dark blue jacket she did not recognize, looking older and more settled than the boy she remembered from university, something in her chest ached with a longing so sharp it nearly took her breath away. Dinner stretched on for nearly 3 hours, filled with easy conversation that picked up almost exactly where they had left off 2 years earlier, as though no time had passed between them at all. Daniel talked about the challenges of working alongside his father, about learning to manage employees twice his age, about the strange, quiet satisfaction of watching a piece of furniture leave the workshop and eventually end up in someone's home. Mira talked about her work at the newspaper, about a story she had recently written on local flooding that had earned her some recognition within the small journalism community, about the strange mix of exhaustion and pride that came with chasing deadlines every single week. "You seem happy," Daniel said at one point, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Really happy. I am glad." "I am," she said, and it was true, even though a large part of her happiness in that particular moment had far more to do with sitting across from him than with anything else in her life. When the dinner finally ended, and they said their goodbyes outside the restaurant, Daniel hugged her tightly, holding on a few seconds longer than a typical friendly hug might last. "We should not let 2 years go by again," he murmured against her hair. "I miss this." "I missed you." Mira held on to those words for weeks afterward, replaying them in her mind, recording an entry that night filled with a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. "Maybe I am not imagining things," she said quietly into her phone. "Maybe there really is something there, buried under all the distance and the years. I do not know. But for the first time in a long time, I let myself hope, even just a little." That hope, however, would not last as long as she wished it might. Life, as it so often does, had other plans waiting just around the corner. Plans that would pull Daniel towards someone else entirely, and leave Mira once again on the outside, quietly recording her way through a heartbreak she had never told anyone she was even capable of feeling. 6 months after that dinner, Daniel called Mira with news that landed like a stone dropped into still water. He had met someone. Her name was Grace, a kind and confident woman who worked as a physical therapist in his hometown, and within a few months of dating, Daniel already sounded certain that he had found something serious. Mira sat on the edge of her bed while he talked, phone pressed tightly against her ear, forcing warmth and enthusiasm into her voice, while something inside her quietly folded in on itself. "That is wonderful," she told him, and she meant it as much as she could manage to mean it, wanting nothing but genuine happiness for him, even as her own heart ached with a grief she had no right to claim. "I really think this could be it," Daniel said, his voice full of an excitement Mira had rarely heard from him before, not even during their years at Ashford. "She is smart and funny, and she does not let me get away with anything. My mother already loves her." Mira offered every appropriate response, asking thoughtful questions, expressing genuine interest in hearing more, all while a familiar tightness built steadily in her chest. When the call finally ended, She sat motionless for a long time, before reaching for her phone again, this time to open her recording app instead. "He sounds happy," she said, her voice already thick with tears she had been holding back throughout the entire conversation. "Really truly happy, in a way I do not think I have ever heard from him before. I should be glad. I am trying to be glad. But it feels like watching a door close on something I never even had the courage to walk through." Over the following year, Mira watched from a careful distance as Daniel and Grace's relationship grew more serious. Daniel mentioned Grace often in their occasional calls and messages, small details slipping in naturally. A trip they had taken together, a dinner with her parents, plans forming for a future that clearly no longer had room for the quiet, unspoken hope Mira had carried for so long. She continued recording throughout this period, though the entries during this time carried a different tone than before, heavier, more resigned, filled with a grief she was slowly learning to carry, rather than resist. "I think I need to accept that this is not going to happen," she admitted one night, nearly 8 months after learning about Grace. "I have loved him for 6 years now. 6 years, and he has no idea. Maybe it is time I finally let this go and started living a life that does not revolve around a feeling he will probably never know exists." She tried, in her own imperfect way, to move forward. She threw herself further into her career, eventually earning a promotion to senior reporter at her newspaper, a position that came with more responsibility and, mercifully, less time to dwell on feelings she was trying hard to release. She dated occasionally, though never seriously, always aware of a quiet emotional wall she could not quite bring herself to lower for anyone else. Then, almost exactly a year after Daniel first mentioned Grace's name, he called again, and this time his voice carried a different kind of nervous excitement. "We are engaged," he told her, the words tumbling out almost breathlessly. "I asked her last weekend. Mira, I actually did it." Congratulations poured out of Mira automatically, practiced and sincere sounding, even as something inside her chest cracked in a way that felt, for a brief and terrifying moment, impossible to survive. She asked all the right questions, about the proposal, about the ring, about how Grace's family had reacted, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will, until the call finally ended, and she was left alone with the silence of her apartment pressing in around her. She did not record anything that night. For the first time in nearly 7 years, Mira sat with her phone in her hand, unable to bring herself to press the button that had, for so long, been the one place she allowed her feelings to exist honestly. It felt, in that moment, as though speaking the truth out loud might make it too real to survive. It took 3 full days before she finally opened the app again, sitting alone in the dark of her apartment on a Sunday night, her voice hoarse from crying that she had mostly done in private, away from friends who had begun gently asking if she was all right. "He is engaged," she finally said, the words coming out flat and exhausted rather than dramatic, as though she had used up every dramatic reaction she had over the previous 3 days, and only plain, tired honesty remained. "I always told myself there was still time. I always told myself I would find the right moment. I do not know why I believed that. There was never going to be a right moment, because I was never brave enough to make one. And now it is too late, and I have no one to blame for that but myself." Mira did not attend the wedding when the invitation eventually arrived nearly a year later, citing a work conflict that was only partially true. She could not bring herself to watch Daniel promise himself to someone else, even though she genuinely wished him every happiness in the world. Instead, she sent a thoughtful gift, a beautifully handwritten card, and spent the day of the wedding alone in her apartment, recording an entry longer and more emotional than almost any she had made before. "I hope she makes him as happy as I always wanted to," Mira said through quiet tears, sitting curled up on her couch with the lights turned low. "I mean that. I really do. He deserves someone who chooses him openly, without hiding, without waiting years to say what she really feels. I was never able to be that person for him, and today, of all days, I have to finally accept that I probably never will be." The years that followed Daniel's wedding passed more quietly for Mira, though not without their own quiet victories. She continued climbing steadily within her career, eventually becoming an editor at a slightly larger publication in a new city, A move that finally, physically, put real distance between herself and the memories she had carried for so long. She made new friends, built a life that felt, on the surface at least, full and satisfying. Contact with Daniel grew rarer during this period, reduced mostly to occasional holiday messages, and the kind of polite, surface-level updates exchanged between old friends who had simply drifted, as most people eventually do, into separate lives. Mira told herself this distance was healthy, necessary even, a natural conclusion to a chapter of her life she needed to close in order to move forward. Yet she never stopped recording entirely. The habit had become too deeply woven into who she was to abandon completely, even as the entries grew shorter, less frequent, and gradually less exclusively about Daniel as her own life expanded to fill the space his absence had left behind. Still, whenever his name resurfaced, in a memory, in a mutual friend's social media post, in the simple sight of a well-made wooden chair in a furniture store window, Mira found herself, almost involuntarily, reaching for her phone to speak the feeling out loud one more time. "I think I will always love him a little," she admitted in one of her final entries from that period, her voice calm now, steadier than it had been in years. "Not in the desperate way I used to, not in a way that controls my life anymore. Just quietly, in the background, the way you love a place you used to live, even after you have built a whole new life somewhere else entirely." She had no way of knowing, recording those words alone in her new apartment in a new city, that circumstances were already quietly moving to bring her and Daniel back into the same orbit once again, in ways neither of them could possibly have predicted, and that everything she had ever recorded about him remained safely stored, waiting patiently, in a cloud account she had almost completely forgotten existed. 3 years after Daniel's wedding, Mira received a job offer that would change the entire direction of her life once again, though she had no idea at the time just how significant that change would turn out to be. A media company called Halden Media, based in a mid-sized city 2 hours from where Daniel and Grace had settled, offered her a senior editorial position, with a salary and set of responsibilities far beyond anything she had managed before. She accepted without much hesitation, drawn by the opportunity itself, rather than any thought of proximity to her past. It was only after she had already signed the contract and begun apartment hunting in her new city that a mutual friend from university mentioned, almost in passing, that Daniel had recently taken a position with a furniture supply partner that worked closely with several companies in the same business district, including, as it happened, Halden Media itself. Mira remembered feeling a strange jolt at the news, a mixture of surprise and something she did not want to examine too closely. She told herself it did not matter. Working in the same general area of a city was hardly the same as working together, and even if their paths crossed occasionally, she was fully capable of maintaining polite, professional distance after everything she had worked so hard to build in the years since his wedding. For the first several months at Halden Media, Mira barely thought about Daniel at all, too consumed with learning her new role, managing a team of writers and editors, and adjusting to life in an unfamiliar city. Her recordings during this period slowed considerably, filled mostly with reflections on her career and the ordinary challenges of building a new life, rather than the aching, decade-old feelings that had once dominated nearly every entry. Then, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon nearly 8 months into her new job, Mira walked into a scheduled meeting with representatives from a vendor company and found herself face-to-face with Daniel Hart for the first time in almost 4 years. He looked older, more settled, a few small lines around his eyes that had not been there during their university days, but unmistakably himself, right down to the way his eyes widened in genuine surprise before breaking into the same easy smile she remembered so vividly from that first rainy afternoon in a lecture hall. "Mira Bennett," he said, standing up from his chair so quickly he nearly knocked over a cup of coffee on the conference table. "I cannot believe this. What are the odds?" The meeting that followed was, by any professional measure, entirely successful, though Mira could hardly remember a single detail of the business discussion afterward. All she could focus on was the strange, disorienting familiarity of hearing his voice again, watching his mannerisms she had once known so well resurface effortlessly, as though no time at all had passed since their last conversation. Afterward, In the hallway outside the conference room, Daniel lingered, clearly reluctant to simply walk away after such an unexpected reunion. "We should catch up properly," he said. "Grab lunch sometime this week, if you have time. I want to hear everything I have missed." Mira agreed, telling herself it was simply the polite, professional thing to do, given that their companies would clearly be working together in some capacity going forward. That night, alone in her apartment, she opened her recording app for the first time in nearly 3 months. "I saw him today," she admitted, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and an ache she had hoped, was mostly behind her by now. "Daniel. Here, of all places. I thought I had moved past this. I thought 4 years and an entire new city was enough distance to finally be free of it. But one conversation, and it is like no time passed at all." Lunch that week turned into a habit neither of them fully planned, but both seemed to welcome, occasional meetings that gradually became more regular as their company's working relationship deepened over the following months. Mira learned, through these lunches, that Daniel's marriage to Grace had ended in a quiet divorce almost 2 years earlier, the details of which he shared carefully, without bitterness, simply as a fact of his life that had reshaped his priorities considerably. "It did not work out the way either of us hoped," he told her one afternoon over sandwiches at a small cafe near their office buildings. "We wanted different things in the end. It was hard, but it was the right decision for both of us. I have been focusing mostly on work since then." And apparently, reconnecting with old friends. Mira absorbed this news with a complicated mixture of sympathy and a hope she immediately felt ashamed of, disgusted with herself for feeling even a flicker of relief at the ending of a marriage that had clearly caused Daniel real pain. That night, she recorded an unusually long and conflicted entry, wrestling honestly with feelings she had spent years trying to convince herself she had outgrown. "I hate that a part of me is glad," she admitted, her voice heavy with guilt. "He was hurt. Whatever happened between them clearly hurt him, and here I am, feeling something close to hope, because it means he is single again. What kind of person does that make me? I do not want to be someone who benefits from his pain. I just cannot seem to stop these feelings from coming back, no matter how many years pass, or how hard I try to bury them." As the months passed, Mira and Daniel's renewed friendship deepened steadily, filled with the same easy, comfortable conversation that had defined their university years, now layered with the added weight of everything both of them had lived through in the years apart. Daniel began confiding in her about his struggles, adjusting to life after his divorce, and Mira found herself, more than once, biting back words that felt dangerously close to a confession she had kept buried for over a decade. It was during this period, roughly 10 years after that first rainy afternoon in a lecture hall, that the IT department at Halden Media announced a company-wide software update intended to modernize the building's internal communication and presentation systems. Employees received a brief email outlining the update, along with instructions to review and approve new permission settings before a certain deadline. Mira, like most of her overworked colleagues, skimmed the email quickly during a busy afternoon, clicked through several confirmation screens without reading the details closely, and returned her attention to a deadline she was already behind on. She had no way of knowing that buried within those confirmation screens was a setting that would link her personal cloud storage account, the very account where a decade of private voice recordings had quietly accumulated, to the same centralized media system used for company-wide presentations and announcements. Somewhere in a server room, several floors below her office, a small, invisible connection had just been made between the most private corner of Mira's inner life and the very public heart of the workplace she now shared, once again, with Daniel Hart. Neither of them had any idea that this quiet, technical mistake would soon bring 10 years of carefully hidden feelings crashing into the open, in front of an entire office full of witnesses, in a moment neither of them would ever forget. Back in the cold, echoing stairwell, Mira stood 2 steps above Daniel, her hand still gripping the railing, waiting for him to say something more. The silence between them stretched long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, mixed with the distant, muffled hum of the office floor above them, slowly returning to something resembling normal activity. "Why did you never tell me?" Daniel finally asked, turning around to face her fully. His expression was not angry, not exactly, but something more complicated. A mixture of confusion, disbelief, and an emotion Mira could not quite name, hovering somewhere close to hurt. Mira opened her mouth several times before any actual words emerged. "I was scared," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared the very first week I met you, and I stayed scared for 10 years. Every time I almost said something, I found a reason to stop myself. It was easier to keep loving you quietly than to risk losing you completely by saying it out loud." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, clearly trying to process the sheer scale of what he had just learned about someone he thought he knew completely. 10 years, he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "Mira, we were together almost every single day during university. I told you things I never told anyone else. And this entire time, you were carrying something this big, and I had absolutely no idea." "I know," she said, tears sliding freely down her face now, no longer bothering to hide them. "I know how that sounds. I know it probably makes you question every single conversation we ever had. But I promise you, our friendship was never a lie. Everything I ever told you, everything we shared, all of that was completely real. I just never found the courage to add one more truth to it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the stairwell floor, as though searching for something written there that might help him make sense of what he had just heard. When he finally looked back up at her, his eyes were softer than before, though still clearly working through a storm of emotion. "The rooftop," he said suddenly. "Our 3rd year. The night with the sparkling cider. I always wondered about that night. I felt something shift between us, and then it just disappeared, and I never understood why." Mira's breath caught sharply in her throat. "You remember that?" she asked, stunned. "Of course I remember that," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly with something that sounded almost like frustration. "I have thought about that night more times than I probably should have over the years. I almost said something to you that night, Mira. I chickened out at the last second, and I always wondered what would have happened if I had not." The revelation hit Mira like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs entirely. "You almost said something too," she repeated, barely able to process the words even as she spoke them herself. "I did," Daniel admitted, running both hands through his hair now, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of everything unfolding between them. "I do not know what stopped me. Maybe I was scared too. Maybe I thought I was imagining things, that you could not possibly feel anything close to what I was starting to feel. So I said nothing, and I told myself it was probably for the best, that we were better as friends anyway." Mira sank down onto the stairwell step behind her, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her steady. 10 years, she whispered, echoing his earlier words back to him. 10 years of both of us being too afraid to say the same thing, at nearly the same moments, over and over again. Above them, the stairwell door opened briefly, and someone from the office peered down, clearly checking to see if the two of them were all right, before quickly retreating and letting the door swing shut again, granting them a small measure of privacy in the middle of what was already an unavoidably public situation. Daniel sat down on the step beside her, close enough that Mira could feel the warmth of him beside her, close enough that 10 years of careful, deliberate distance suddenly felt almost impossible to maintain. "I need some time to process all of this," he said honestly, his voice gentler now than it had been since the recordings first began playing. "This is a lot, Mira. This is genuinely a lot to take in all at once." "I understand," she said quietly, even though understanding did nothing to ease the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "If you need space, if you need to walk away from this completely, I understand that too. I never wanted to force any of this on you. It was never supposed to come out this way. It was never supposed to come out at all." Daniel turned to look at her then, his expression shifting into something more thoughtful, more deliberate. "That is exactly the problem though, is not it?" he said slowly. "You never wanted it to come out at all. You were prepared to carry this alone forever, weren't you? Even now, even after everything just happened, some part of you still seems ready to apologize for feeling something real." Mira did not have an immediate answer for that. She simply sat beside him in the quiet stairwell, tears still slipping silently down her cheeks, uncertain whether the ache building in her chest was born from fear, relief, or some complicated combination of both that she had never before allowed herself to feel so openly. Daniel reached over, hesitantly at first, and gently took her hand in his. "I am not walking away," he said quietly, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "I need time to think through everything I just heard, everything I just learned. But I am not walking away from you, Mira. Not after everything I just found out about how long you have been walking beside me, quietly, carrying all of this on your own." Relief crashed through Mira so suddenly and so completely that she nearly could not breathe past it. She squeezed his hand back, unable to trust her own voice with anything meaningful, simply grateful, in that raw, exposed moment, that 10 years of silence had not ended with him disappearing from her life entirely. They sat together in that stairwell for a long while, neither of them speaking much, simply existing together in the strange, charged aftermath of a truth that had finally, after a full decade, forced its way out into the open. Above them, life at Halden Media continued moving forward, phones ringing, meetings starting, co-workers slowly returning their attention to spreadsheets and deadlines, even as the story of what had happened that morning would undoubtedly circulate through the office for weeks to come. But for Mira, sitting quietly beside Daniel with her hand still held gently in his, none of that outside noise seemed to matter nearly as much as the fragile, uncertain new territory the two of them had just, finally, after 10 long years, begun to step into together. The days following the recording incident were, for Mira, some of the strangest of her entire life. Word of what happened spread through Halden Media faster than she could have imagined, transforming from whispered gossip near the coffee machine into something close to office legend within a matter of days. Co-workers who had barely spoken to her before suddenly greeted her with knowing smiles, and Priya, the woman who sat 2 desks away, made a point of telling her, quietly and kindly, that she thought what Mira had done, even unintentionally, was one of the most honest things she had ever witnessed at work. "You did not choose for it to happen this way," Priya told her over lunch a few days later, her voice gentle but firm. "But for what it is worth, I think everyone who heard those recordings understood exactly how real your feelings were. Nobody records something like that for 10 years, unless it actually means something." Mira appreciated the kindness, even as embarrassment continued to prickle uncomfortably beneath her skin every time she walked past a colleague who had clearly heard at least part of her most private thoughts broadcast over the office speakers. She avoided the break room for nearly a week, taking her lunches alone at her desk, unable to fully shake the vulnerability of having her inner life exposed so completely, so publicly, without any warning or control over the moment. Daniel, for his part, needed several days before he reached out to suggest they talk properly, away from the office and the watching eyes of coworkers, who had suddenly become invested spectators in a story that was, at its core, deeply personal to both of them. He asked Mira to meet him at a quiet park near the river that ran through the center of the city, a place neither of them had any particular history with, chosen specifically, Mira suspected, because it offered no ghosts from their shared past to complicate an already complicated conversation. They sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the water, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the path in front of them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, both apparently gathering courage for a conversation that had been 10 years in the making, even though only a handful of days had passed since the truth first came spilling out. "I listened to some of the recordings," Daniel finally admitted, his eyes fixed on the slow-moving water in front of them, rather than on her. "After I calmed down enough to think clearly, IT managed to isolate the files before deleting them from the shared system, and they asked if I wanted a copy, since my name was mentioned so extensively. I said yes." Mira's stomach tightened with a fresh wave of vulnerability at the thought of Daniel sitting alone, listening deliberately to years of her most private thoughts, rather than simply hearing them accidentally through an office speaker system. "What did you think?" she asked carefully, almost afraid of the answer. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think I finally understand things about our friendship that never quite made sense to me before," he said slowly. "Little moments I always wondered about. The way you sometimes seemed sad after I mentioned dating someone, even though you always insisted you were happy for me. The way you disappeared for a few days right after my engagement, and came back saying you had just been busy with work. It all makes sense now, in a way it never did before." Mira felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, though she forced herself to hold his gaze rather than look away, as she might once have done. "I am sorry you had to find out everything all at once. Like this," she said honestly. "You deserve to hear it from me, in my own words, whenever I finally found the courage to say it. Not through a broken office system in front of half our coworkers." "Maybe," Daniel said thoughtfully, though there was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet, searching honesty. "But I do not think you ever would have told me, Mira. Not really. I think you would have kept recording your feelings into that phone for another 10 years, if this had not happened, and I would have kept wondering, every so often, why something between us always felt slightly unfinished, without ever understanding why." The observation landed with an uncomfortable accuracy that Mira could not honestly argue against. "You might be right," she admitted quietly. "I told myself I was protecting our friendship by staying silent. But maybe I was really just protecting myself from the risk of losing something I was too afraid to try building into something more." Daniel finally turned to look at her directly, something warm and searching in his expression that made Mira's heart beat a little faster, despite the exhaustion of the past several days. "I have had a lot of time to think since that recording started playing," he said. "And I keep coming back to the same thing. 10 years, Mira. 10 years of feeling something this real, and never once acting on it. That takes a kind of quiet strength I do not think I fully appreciated until I understood how much you were carrying the entire time." "I would not call it strength," Mira said softly. "It felt more like cowardice most days." "Maybe it was both," Daniel offered gently. "But I do not want to spend any more time focused on what did not happen over the past 10 years. I want to talk about what happens now, if you are willing." Mira's breath caught in her chest at the quiet weight of his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, hardly daring to hope for the answer she wanted. "I mean," Daniel said, reaching over to take her hand the way he had in the stairwell days earlier, "that I spent this past week thinking about everything I heard in those recordings, and somewhere in the middle of all that thinking, I realized I did not just feel sympathy for what you went through. I felt something else too, something that made me start wondering whether the timing that kept getting in our way all those years might finally, somehow, be catching up to where it should have been all along." Mira's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" she asked carefully, needing to hear the words spoken plainly, after 10 years of guessing, and hoping, and recording feelings she had never dared say aloud, to the one person who mattered most. Daniel smiled then, the same easy, warm smile she remembered from that very first rainy afternoon in a university lecture hall, a decade and an entire lifetime ago. "I am saying I would like to actually try this," he said simply. "Not as friends pretending distance does not exist between us, not as two people too afraid to say what we really feel. I would like to see what happens if we finally stop waiting for the right moment, and just choose each other, out loud, starting today." Tears filled Mira's eyes again, though this time they carried none of the fear and shame of the past week, only a relief so overwhelming it felt almost impossible to contain. "I would like that too," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "More than I think I have ever wanted anything in my entire life." They sat together on that bench for a long while afterward, watching the river move slowly past them in the fading afternoon light, hands still joined between them. Finally, after 10 long years of silence and distance and careful, guarded feelings, allowing themselves to simply exist together in the open, without hiding anything at all. In the weeks that followed their conversation by the river, Mira and Daniel began, carefully and deliberately, to build something entirely new out of the years of friendship that had come before. It was strange at first, learning to see each other through this different lens, strange to reach for his hand without hesitation, strange to say things out loud that she had only ever dared whisper into the privacy of a phone recording late at night. Some habits from their old friendship carried over easily, comfortable and familiar. They still argued playfully about which of them had actually been the better study partner all those years ago at Ashford, still shared the same easy laughter over small, ordinary things, still found comfort in each other's company during long, tiring weeks at work. But other things shifted in ways that felt both thrilling and, at times, quietly overwhelming for someone who had spent an entire decade guarding her feelings so carefully. "I keep waiting to wake up from this," Mira admitted one evening, several weeks into their new relationship. as they sat together on the small balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker on below them. Part of me still expects something to go wrong. Some reason this cannot actually be real. Daniel reached over and took her hand, the gesture already becoming familiar in a way that still managed to send a small thrill through her every single time. "I think that is fair," he said gently. 10 years is a long time to convince yourself something is impossible. It makes sense that trusting it now would not just happen overnight. Their co-workers at Halden Media, meanwhile, had mostly moved on from the excitement of the initial incident, though gentle teasing occasionally surfaced whenever Mira and Daniel appeared together in meetings involving both their companies. Priya, in particular, took an almost personal pride in what had happened, occasionally reminding Mira, with a knowing smile, that she had predicted a happy outcome from the very beginning, even during the chaos of that first, mortifying morning. "I still cannot believe an entire office heard my private thoughts before I even had the chance to tell him myself," Mira said one afternoon, laughing, despite the lingering embarrassment that occasionally resurfaced when she thought back to that morning. "It is such a strange way for something like this to finally come out into the open." "Maybe it needed to happen exactly that way," Daniel offered thoughtfully. "I do not think either of us was ever going to say something on our own. We both proved that, over and over, for 10 straight years. Maybe it took something completely out of our control to finally push us toward the conversation we should have had a long time ago." Mira could not entirely disagree with him. As frightening and humiliating as that morning had been, standing frozen by the coffee machine while her own voice exposed a decade of carefully guarded feelings, it had also, undeniably, given her something she had never managed to find the courage to create on her own, a genuine, honest beginning with the person she had loved quietly for so long. She still recorded occasionally, though the nature of her entries had changed completely. Instead of private confessions meant only for herself, she began recording small, happy observations about her actual life with Daniel, moments she wanted to remember clearly, rather than feelings she was too afraid to share. "Today he brought me flowers for absolutely no reason," she recorded one evening, smiling as she spoke into her phone, no longer whispering in the dark the way she once had, but sitting openly on her couch with the lights on and the windows uncovered. "He said it was because it was a nice day, and he was thinking of me. I used to record entries like this, filled with hope and fear and uncertainty. Now I get to record them filled with something that actually happened, instead of something I only wished would happen someday." 3 months into their relationship, Daniel invited Mira to meet his family properly, an invitation that filled her with a familiar nervousness, even as she recognized how far they had already come together. His mother, upon learning the full story of how their relationship had finally begun, laughed so hard she had to sit down, insisting it was the most unusual and yet somehow perfectly fitting love story she had ever heard in her entire life. 10 years of quiet devotion," she said warmly, squeezing Mira's hand across the dinner table. "That is not something to be embarrassed about, dear. That is something worth celebrating. Not many people love someone that patiently, that consistently, for that long, without ever giving up completely." Mira felt tears prick at her eyes at the kindness in the older woman's words, a validation she had not realized, until that moment, she desperately needed to hear. "I just wish I had found the courage to say something sooner," she admitted quietly. "We lost so much time." Daniel's mother shook her head gently. "Or maybe you both needed exactly this much time," she said. "Maybe some love stories are not about speed. Maybe they are simply about two people finally arriving at the right moment together, however long that takes." As the months continued passing, Mira found herself reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this point. From a rainy lecture hall at 19 years old, to a stairwell confrontation at nearly 30, 10 years of hidden feelings, finally spilling out into the open through the most unlikely and mortifying of circumstances. She no longer felt embarrassed by how it had happened, only grateful, in a deep and quiet way, that it had happened at all. 1 year after that chaotic Tuesday morning at Halden Media, Daniel took Mira back to that same rooftop garden at their old university, now overgrown slightly with new plants, but still recognizably the same quiet spot where they had once sat together, drinking sparkling cider, and nearly, but not quite, telling each other the truth. "I have been thinking about this place a lot lately," Daniel said, standing beside her at the low stone wall where they had once watched a sunset together, as anxious, uncertain 20-year-olds. About everything that almost happened here, and everything that finally did happen, 10 years later than it probably should have. Mira smiled, leaning into him slightly as the evening breeze moved gently around them. I would not change how it happened, she admitted honestly. Even the humiliating parts, even the 10 years of silence, all of it led us here, to exactly this moment, and I would not trade that for anything, no matter how much easier the path might have looked, if I had just been braver sooner. Daniel turned to face her fully then, something serious and tender in his expression that made Mira's heart skip in a way that felt, even after a full year together, still wonderfully new. I love you, he said simply, the words landing with a quiet, steady certainty. Not the version of me from 10 years ago who almost said it and lost his nerve. Me, right now, completely certain, completely sure. I love you too, Mira answered, the words leaving her easily now, without fear, without hesitation, without the need to whisper them into a phone in the dark, where no one but herself would ever hear them. Standing together on that same rooftop where everything had almost begun a decade earlier, Mira finally understood that some stories do not follow a straight or simple path. Some take 10 years, painful silence, and one deeply embarrassing accident to finally arrive exactly where they were always meant to go. And as she stood there in the fading evening light, held gently in the arms of the person she had loved quietly for so long, she knew, without a single doubt remaining, that every difficult year of waiting had finally, completely, been worth it. 2 years after the morning, her secret spilled out across an entire office floor. Mira stood in a small dressing room in the back of an old stone chapel, watching her hands tremble slightly, as Nora, her old college roommate, carefully adjusted the buttons along the back of her dress. You are shaking worse than you did during finals week, Nora teased gently. Though her eyes were bright with tears, she was clearly fighting to hold back. I never thought I would actually see this day happen. 10 years of secret recordings, and now look at you. Mira laughed, a little breathless, smoothing her hands over the fabric of her dress. I never thought I would see it either, she admitted. There were so many years where I genuinely believed this would never be my life. I used to record myself imagining it, just to feel like it was possible, even if it never actually happened. Nora squeezed her shoulder warmly. Well, it happened, she said simply. And honestly, I think it happened exactly the way it was supposed to, even if the middle part was a little chaotic. Through the thin chapel walls, Mira could hear the low hum of gathering guests, familiar voices mixed together, co-workers from Halden Media, who had become genuine friends over the past 2 years, Daniel's family, her own parents, who had driven 6 hours to be there for the day their daughter had waited a decade to reach. Somewhere among that crowd sat Priya, who still occasionally reminded Mira, with obvious pride, that she had believed in this outcome from the very first chaotic morning it all began. When the music finally began, and the chapel doors opened, Mira walked down the aisle with her father beside her, her eyes finding Daniel immediately, standing at the front in a dark suit, his expression open and unguarded, in a way that made her chest ache with a happiness she had once been certain she would never fully allow herself to feel. He did not try to hide his emotion as she approached, tears gathering openly in his eyes, despite his obvious effort to remain composed in front of the gathered crowd. When she finally reached him, taking his hands in hers, he leaned close enough to whisper something meant only for her. 10 years, he murmured, echoing words that had once shattered her entire sense of safety in a stairwell, now transformed into something warm and steady instead, worth every single one of them. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and quiet joy, the kind of day Mira had once believed existed only in the recordings she used to whisper alone in the dark, imagined futures she never truly expected to become real. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the small chapel erupted into applause, and Mira felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely free of the fear that had shaped so much of her adult life. At the reception that followed, held in a converted barn just outside the city, with string lights strung across the wooden beams overhead, Daniel's mother rose during the toasts, glass raised, a warm smile spreading across her face, as she looked between her son and his new wife. "I want to tell everyone here a story," she began, and Mira felt her cheeks flush slightly, already guessing what was coming. 10 years ago, my son sat next to a girl in a lecture hall during a rainstorm, and neither of them had any idea what that single moment would eventually lead to. It took an office computer mistake, of all things, to finally bring them together. But watching them today, I do not think it could have happened any other way. Some love simply needs time to find its courage, and I have never in my life seen two people find that courage more completely than these two finally did. Laughter and applause rippled through the barn, and Mira caught Daniel's eye across the table, both of them sharing a knowing smile at the strange, unlikely path that had brought them to this exact moment, surrounded by everyone who mattered most to them. Later that evening, as the reception wound down and guests began drifting toward the exit, with warm hugs and well wishes, Mira found a quiet moment alone, with Daniel near the edge of the dance floor, the string lights glowing softly above them in the cooling night air. "Can I tell you something?" she said softly, echoing, without quite meaning to, the same words he had once spoken to her on a rooftop years earlier. "Always," he answered, pulling her gently closer. "I still have every single recording," she admitted. "All 10 years of them. I could not bring myself to delete them, even after everything that happened. I think, someday, I want our children to hear them. Not all of them, but some. I want them to know how long I loved their father before I ever found the courage to tell him." Daniel's eyes softened, and he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before answering. "I think that sounds perfect," he said quietly. "Because if there is one thing I have learned from everything we went through to get here, it is that the story is not really about the 10 years we lost. It is about everything we get to build now that we finally stopped waiting." Mira rested her head against his shoulder, watching the last of the string lights flicker gently above the emptying dance floor, feeling, for the first time in her entire adult life, completely certain of exactly where she belonged. 10 years of silence, one chaotic accident, and an entire decade of quiet hope had finally led her here, to this exact moment, standing beside the only person she had ever truly wanted to spend her life with. And as the night settled quietly around them, Mira understood, with a peace she had never known before, that some love stories take the long way home, but they arrive exactly when they are meant to, carrying with them every single year of patience, fear, and quiet devotion that made the final arrival feel entirely, completely worth it.